Thank you so much for joining the Transportation Choices Transit Talks. This is the first Transit Talks of 2017, and we're excited to kick off a great year of transit with you all on February 1st. I am the Advocacy Director at Transportation Choices. My name is Abigail, and and Transportation Choices is a statewide advocacy, education, and policy organization working to expand public transit and grow vibrant communities around our state. We are thrilled to have an exciting panel of people here, and Erica C. Barnett will be moderating this discussion. Erica is the founder of C for Crank, where she writes about politics, news, and urbanism, and I imagine most of you here are regular readers, and yes. I encourage you to support her website, and we appreciate having her here to moderate. I also want to say a quick thank you to the City of Seattle for allowing us to use this space, and Councilmember Rob Johnson, who should be joining us once a meeting ends upstairs, and his staff for helping get us this room. So with no further ado, here's Erica.
I want to kick this off by just asking both of you, or all three of you, rather, what's your New Year's resolution for transportation in 2017? And this can be a personal resolution, you want to ride the bus more, or it can be something you hope to accomplish politically or something you want to accomplish for an agency that you represent.
So last year, 2016 in transportation was such a big year. It was a year of sort of big vision, long-range thinking, major accomplishments. This year, I have resolved to go small. This year, I want to work on opening new segments of the East Side Rail Corridor and improving aspects of the I-90 bike corridor so that people have great access to trails, walking, biking, and that I myself will be motivated to maybe get back on my own bike in the process. There's a lot, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, there's a lot going on in policy, in funding, in implementation of the big vision, but when I think about this year and all the other things that will be going on, the idea of having a nice, peaceful place for people to ride their bikes seems like it would be a really good thing.
Professionally, obviously, Sound Transit is now about the business of knuckling under and preparing itself to deliver what we promised to the voters. And that is not a small task. We are currently about the business of knuckling under to develop what we call our program implementation plan, which we'll be presenting to our board of directors, which includes Claudia Balducci this spring. But it really is a way of, we're taking the time to take a quick breath to, reimagine how we're going to sort of take everything that we've been doing to date and take it up to a level where we can literally expand our rail network north, south, east, and west at the same time while doing high-quality bus rapid transit, while expanding sounder frequencies. The one thing we know as an agency, and the one thing that everyone within the agency agrees on, is we can't just take the model of what we're doing now and multiply it by the appropriate multiple and think that we are all going to swimmingly deliver these projects the way we've been able to deliver them. So we are taking a very hard look at our processes, how we coordinate across lines of business and how we can improve the communication between our lines of business, how we're going to co-locate project teams, how one of the things I haven't done it yet because but one of the things I'll be doing is hiring a sort of chief customer experience officer to kind of focus precisely on the day-to-day customer experience rather than whether things fit in, right within the operations allowable tolerances of the passenger experience. There's a lot to do, and we need to do it relatively quickly, in part because many of you will remember for those of you who were sort of part of the development of the ST3 ballot measure, we came out with a plan in March that met with a lot of reticence and concern from the many stakeholders over how long it was going to take to deliver these projects. They're still concerned about how long that we would all like to deliver them all sooner. We then, between March and the final plan in June, between reworking our financial model and also really kind of knuckling under and sharpening pencils, came out with more aggressive delivery dates. Well, we came out with those delivery dates, the voters endorsed it, and now we have to deliver. And now we're staring at them and saying, like, there's no year to take a breath here. We need to get started. So you will start seeing an extraordinary number of actions coming before our board of directors to start approving things like, contracts to start beginning the environmental work for Ballard and West Seattle, about the necessary contracts to get us to Redmond. We can now get to Federal Way just a year later than we were going to get to Kent Des Moines, and actually putting this stuff in process to deliver on what we promised. That's sort of the professional resolution. The personal resolution is for me to actually be more of a pedestrian. It's in part, my wife and I just figured out, I've now been here 13 months and I've gained 1 pound for every month I've been here. And we're going to try and walk that backwards. So that's my personal resolution.
So I spent all of last year meeting with community members to get a really great Sound Transit 3 package on the ballot, and then working to pass that measure. And my resolution for this year is to elevate all of the voices and the amazing people who voted and supported this package, and make sure they're participating in what the future of the system looks like. And especially people who may not already be at the table. And that's a really huge goal for Transportation Choices this year, and that is the core of what our work moving forward is going to be. And personally, my personal resolution is to eat breakfast every day. This was my goal last year through the campaign, and I did okay at it, and this year I am definitely going to try to do it every day.
And I got a walk tracker. I don't know what you call those things, but I'm counting my steps this year, so that's mine. So let's dive right in with a question about what's happening at the federal level. And this is kind of a different question for each of you, so I'll start with Peter. The new administration has said that it wants to make massive cuts to spending on public transit, and just appointed a new, and the Senate confirmed a new transportation secretary, Elaine Chao, I believe just today. So my question is, what does that mean for Sound Transit? What does it mean for the $1 billion to finish ST to Linwood that you helped get approved as director of the FDA? What does the next 4 years look like for you?
Well, I think the real fair answer to that question is nobody knows yet. I don't even necessarily agree with your observation that they have affirmatively called for massive cuts to public transit spending. They've said a lot of different things, frankly, both through the campaign, and all you've got now is one Senate-confirmed official in comparison to what generally numbers about 115 political appointees that will eventually populate the Department of Transportation. They have also indicated that perhaps they're not even going to submit a line-by-line budget by 2018, indicating that it really is going to be Congress's job to nail those spending levels. I've watched the trajectory of transportation spending from every presidential transition, beginning from Reagan to Bush, Bush the elder, there's a lot of upticks that come as proposals from some administration and downticks that come with proposals from other administrations. But often Congress levels out those upticks and downticks quite a bit. So in the end, Congress is going to send, final appropriations bills to the White House, and the new president is either going to sign them or not. I think what's important is us to be diligent and to watch this space. We do have a considerable, sizable federal commitment to Linwood. We are also seeking federal funds to get to Federal Way. In total, however, the federal funding commitment to the entire ST3 program is only about 13%. And quite frankly, I lowered that from 18% when I got here because I didn't think it was reasonable for us, no matter who was going to be president, to think that the federal government was going to ramp up its spending just because the Puget Sound area was going to ramp up its spending. But, it will be harder absent that 13% of the funding, but I think the jury it's still way too early. This is Elaine Chow's third tour through the Department of Transportation. I did work with her briefly when she was Deputy Secretary under Secretary Skinner. She understands and knows what the role of the FTA is. I would just say watch this space and see if things come out in terms of their proposals to be as draconian as initially advertised. But since Rob is now here, I'll also point out that Elaine Chow is a former director of Wells Fargo, just FYI.
Well, that's a great segue. Rob, we're talking about, thanks for coming. I know you had a meeting right upstairs.
Sorry to be late.
No worries. Thanks.
It was a busy morning.
Yeah, so I hear. What you missed was just a very quick round about what your New Year's resolution is for transportation, personally, or I guess at SDOT for you. And what we're talking about now is what the new administration's impact is going to be on funding for transit. So I guess if you could sort of quickly answer that first question, but also just what does this mean for SDOT and for the funding that SDOT receives from the federal government? Trump has said, and we don't know what he will actually do, but has said that, or has called for a transportation budget that cuts funding for public transit. And so I imagine that's something that you must be preparing for.
Sorry again, everybody, for being late. My name is Rob Johnson. I'm a city council member here at the City of Seattle. I also happen to have been intimately involved with transportation choices for several years as first a policy staffer and then as its executive director. I also serve as a member of the Sound Transit Board. So when Peter says jump, I say how high. As an elected official in this region, I think we are really fortunate to have seen such a huge, overwhelming support, particularly within the city of Seattle, but all throughout the region for ST3. I think my New Year's resolution for 2017 is to continue the progress that we've made as a city and working with Sound Transit so that we're really ready to deliver those ST3 projects as quickly as we can. There's a whole lot of other integrated parts of the city along with ST2 development that I think we could really continue to improve upon, and that gets a lot to the relationship we have with King County Metro as well. We don't have really wonderful transfer environments right now at the Husky Stadium station, for example. We could do a much better job of not only improving those, but learning those lessons as we expand further north into the University of Washington, Brooklyn Station, Roosevelt, and then all the way up to Northgate. I also am really interested in what we can do as a city to work to collaborate with King County on the next generation of their rapid ride lines to make sure that we're dedicating actual city right-of-way to make sure that those buses don't get stuck in traffic. About 30% of our city land is our roadway system. I fundamentally believe we should be dedicating more of that road so that all those folks that get on and off a Metro bus every day have the same reliability that those train riders do. To your question about federal funding, we took a very strong stand about a week ago. I'm sorry. We took a very strong stand yesterday. Thanks. On sanctuary cities, and as the president has outlined, he has threatened that he will eliminate federal funding for any city that is identified as a sanctuary city. That puts as much as $75 or $80 million a year of city funding that we get from our federal partners for things like police, transit, human services. We've committed to making sure that we fight back against those cuts. There is a strong argument that we can make that says you can't cut our transportation dollars because of a decision that we make on immigration. But we're also prepared to lose every single penny of those federal funds in order to make sure that our city is a welcoming city for everybody. The final thing that I will say is I've had a lot of conversations with folks over the last couple of days just about federal funding and associated federal funding with ST2 and ST3. No one is better positioned to understand that than our CEO. But I would say that I think the biggest concern for me is watching out for the appropriation process on an annual basis and just making sure that the funds that have been committed to us through those full funding grant agreements actually gets appropriated to us, not only as Sound Transit as a region, but also the City of Seattle and the work that we've had to.
Abigail, what's TCC doing, and what are you guys working on as advocates within this new context of the possible loss of federal funding for transit in Seattle?
Yeah, I think it's Peter outlined, and as Rob outlined, there's a lot of uncertainty about what that means for directly and how we'll be impacted by this work. We know about what type of funding we could be losing for a Linwood Link, or is on the table for Linwood Link and future projects like the Tiger Grant programs, which we have supported. But I think the most relevant thing is transit is intersectional, right? Access to reliable transportation is the single biggest barrier to helping people move up the economic ladder. It's communities of color, immigrants, refugees, and low-income people face this disproportionately. And when people can get where they need to go, it's people have health care, when people can get to school and afford school. I think all of the issues that are sort of peripheral to transit are impacting our communities. And I think it is important for us to stand in solidarity with all of the other issues that are facing our neighbors and our friends, and ensure that we do create a safe and welcoming space. I mean, the transit money specifically is really in question, and we're ready and monitoring that very closely, but also standing in solidarity with our immigrant and refugees friends. Monitoring healthcare, which is also essential for our healthy communities, is critical for us moving forward.
Claudia, same question for you. I want to add a little spin to it, though. There is, as anyone who's ridden Rapid Ride has noticed, it's incredibly popular, which also means it's incredibly crowded. So I have a question about, how Metro is going to manage to keep increasing service hours on that service, particularly if there is a loss of funding from the federal government.
Yeah, I'm going to come at that a little sideways, but I'll get there. I want to add on to what Councilmember Johnson said. At King County, we also took an action this week to state to condemn the executive order on immigration, and to stand in solidarity with Seattle and other jurisdictions around the county who have said that we are a welcoming jurisdiction. We will not cooperate with this kind of attack on people who live here. And that was strongly supported at the county. Interestingly, as part of my background, I have been in the criminal justice system. I used to run the King County jail system, and we've got an interesting dynamic there with the federal government on immigration, because it's been a few years now since we said that we wouldn't honor ICE detainers, which essentially are an order from the Immigration and Control Enforcement Agency to a local government that says, you have this person in custody, we think they may be here in the country illegally, so after they've been released by the court system in your jurisdiction and you would otherwise let them go, they're done, we want you to hold them for up to 3 more days so that we can decide whether or not we want to take them into custody and deport them. And for a number of reasons, including the fact that some federal courts have started to say that that's unconstitutional to hold people after you no longer have a basis to hold them, we stopped doing that. So we do expect to see some retaliation in the form of lost federal funding. Most obviously, and I'm really surprised this hasn't been done already, frankly, the federal government gives us about $1 million a year in compensation for holding illegal immigrants in detention. I expect we will lose that money, and frankly, that's fine, because we've decided we're not going to do that. So, thanks. But we have a large federal contribution to King County functions, and King County public health is seriously at risk, both from a loss of federal money and from a potential repeal of the Affordable Care Act. So this is just a really big picture. It goes well beyond transportation, what might happen in our communities if the federal government does proceed to cut funding the way some of their comments, not all, but some have suggested they will. On the buses, there's not a lot of, and I don't know if there's any actually federal funding in our operations. Does anybody here from Metro could shake their head at me? I don't think Metro gets Chris Harkills, we don't get federal funding for bus operations. Right. So the question of whether rapid ride or any Metro bus service will deteriorate is not going to be dependent on what the feds do. The question of whether we can afford to increase service because of the demand and the growth that's going on is a different question entirely. And this year we're able to invest 300,000 more hours. So we're back in Metro in growth mode just because our funding sources are on the increase, which is nice. But the demand is higher than that. We're not meeting our own metrics in terms of meeting demand. And we just adopted the long-range plan for Metro, Metro Connects, which talks about not just continuing and enhancing the rapid rides we have today, which is, I believe, A through F, but also over the next 20 years, adding new rapid ride lines till we have 26. So we're going to have A through Z. And that is, we're going to have to get to work on how do we fund those, because they're not funded yet. And that is something that we will be talking to all of you about. We just funded ST3, but that doesn't mean we're done with funding transit. We need to fund the Metro system so that it can sort of create this seamless web along with light rail and the regional services Sound Transit provide. In about 2040, we're going to have, I think, one of the best, if not the best, transit systems in the nation, but we still have to figure out how to fund parts of it, and we're going to be talking about that as we go forward.
I want to ask a follow-up about that specifically for both you and Councilmember Johnson. Metro has proposed all these new rapid ride lines, and I'm wondering how both King County and also the city are planning to hold the line on making them true bus rapid transit as opposed to buses that share lanes, so that they actually do function more like true rapid transit. And that's a question both for ESTA and for the county.
If you don't mind, I'll just sort of continue and then hand it off. The vision, and one of the cool things I think about the Metro Connects vision is that Metro has been an operations-only sort of bus outfit for a number of years now. We haven't been in the business of doing capital improvements for quite a while because of our funding situation. Metro Connects envisions that we will get back into capital funding, that we will actually do upgrades to the bus environment, the travel environment with our partners. It also assumes a whole lot of partnership with the jurisdictions that we travel through so that we will be able to have speed, reliability, and not have just sort of buses sitting in traffic and local milk runs as opposed to having true rapid transit. But again, we're at the beginning of this discussion, and it's going to have to, I think we have a great partner in the city of Seattle and some of our other cities, but we also have cities that this is kind of new for them. They haven't really done or thought about bus priority at their signal intersections. And I think the more people roll out this kind of service, especially in places like Seattle where they get it, and Bellevue, I will say, where we're increasingly getting it, the more other jurisdictions will see the benefit and want to join in because their people will demand that level of service. But that we are way at the beginning of those conversations.
I would say three things need to happen for us to really achieve that vision of creating a capital facility in the city that makes transit riding as time competitive as anything else. The first is we need the political will from the mayor's office and the Department of Transportation to make sure that we are proposing capital facilities that make it bus only. The second is we need support from advocates like Transportation Choices to show up and build coalitions of support to make sure that we don't get overwhelmed by opposition from community. And then the third is we need to connect with the individuals on the ground about the rationale for why. I can't tell you how many times I have a conversation with somebody who articulates their strong environmental values and in the same breath talks to me about how important it is for us to have more parking spaces in the city. We need to do a much better job of connecting the values of our city around sustainability, around environment, around race and social justice with important capital infrastructure investments like bus-only lanes. I'll use a milk run in the city like the 44 is a really great example. That's a critical bus route that runs basically from the very tail end of Ballard all the way through Fremont, Wallingford to the University of Washington. And I believe we should be expanding that as a rapid ride corridor and running it actually all the way down to University Village and around the corner to Children's Hospital. When we make a decision like that, we're going to receive opposition not just from community, but also likely from business owners on that corridor who will say, taking away parking spaces hurts my business. When my argument would be everybody who gets on and off that bus has a wallet too, and they could be spending money in your business. And there's a lot of facts and figures and research to back up that those transit riders are actually spending more money in local businesses than drivers are. So we need to do a better job of connecting up those values with our citizens too.
And if I could just add one more thing, one of the things we're going to have to work at, and as part of our long-range vision for transit, is what we like to call the last mile connection. It's getting people from their front door, their driveway, to transit without them having to get into their car first, to the point about parking spaces and the best use of land. And so I think there's some interesting partnerships that we're going to be trying out in the near future around TNCs, which I always forget what they stand for. Everybody here? Thank you very much. Transportation network companies, the Ubers, the Lyfts of the world, and others to make it easy for somebody to walk out their front door, their jacket and their purse, and just go wherever they need to go, because that will help us with the sorts of discussions you're talking about around, but I can't get on transit anyway because there's not a ginormous enough park and ride within a mile of my house for me to go do that. And that's a huge discussion over in the suburbs where I'm from.
Staying on the topic of race and social justice, which Rob brought up, it's noticeable for people who live in Southeast Seattle in particular that that light rail runs on the surface there. There was a tragic death last month, someone being struck by light rail, and this has happened, more than once, obviously, dozens of times, sadly. And so I'm wondering, and it's also noticeable that a place like Bellevue has a tunnel. And I'm wondering, anybody who wants to jump in on this, including Peter, what is Sound Transit doing to integrate race and social justice concerns like that into future planning?
Sure. Well, good question. Yeah, the death last week was particularly tragic and came on top of, a difficult time for the agency. It always sort of shakes us to the core, and as you might imagine, there's a King County Metro operator who was operating our light rail vehicles under contract who had the whole thing unfold in front of him. Part of this has to do with the maturation of Sound Transit and where the agency was 20 years ago when decisions were going to be made at how to get light rail into the ground and starting to serve communities at a certain funding level versus where we are now 3 ballot measures later. 3 ballot measures later, we are sufficiently well funded to make planning decisions that eliminate grade crossings pretty much wherever possible. There's very few at-grade alignments. We're either elevated or subgrade for the ST3 network, as we are for much of the ST2 network. Deciding to go at grade at the Rainier Valley was a decision that I think was made as a matter of, cost at a time when the agency was both less well-financed, less sophisticated. That said, we are currently reviewing every one of our safety treatments along the alignment, which is something that an agency should be doing routinely. And we were doing it, frankly, before this fatality, is taking a fresh look at making sure that the best safety treatments that we could have for pedestrians, for cars, are in place. There are certain dynamics that we're having, and this is not just a light rail or rail grade crossing safety risk. It is also, frankly, more prominently a pedestrian safety risk. This tendency for people to be walking the streets, looking at their devices or with earbuds in their ears is going to kill a whole bunch of people. It already is. And there's only so much we can do, frankly, if someone is going to insist on walking singularly focused on a device with music playing in their ears when our warnings, our available warnings to us, in addition to putting down gates to actually block them, is lights and alarms. So this is something that we're looking at in the Rainier Valley of what more we can do. Other things that we're doing, frankly, on the social justice front, one in the Rainier Valley, is we're finally going to build Graham Street, which was something that was got one fan. And actually,
Yay.
we got a lot more than that in the community. And this was, frankly, a social justice issue. We are, as far as I've been able to recount the history here, is just redressing a past wrong. And also, just in our community outreach, so Rainier Valley, if you will, is a historic community, but communities are changing all around us. And when you get into, for example, the affordable housing challenge that the region has, and the new mandates that we have as it relates to affordable housing and trying to develop affordable housing with surplus property around our projects going forward, it's a real opportunity to make sure that the communities that we're expanding rail into are available to all. There's obviously more we can do, but it's when I talked earlier about my New Year's resolution of putting together an implementation plan and working through how we're going to roll all this out. The whole new TOD initiative and affordable housing initiative is a very important part of that.
If you don't mind, I just a few things to add to that. I think there's a number of ways in which equity and social justice needs to play into the work as we go forward. I mean, the plan has more or less been set at this point, but and when you talk about where we serve, so I think it was a good thing that light rail went south from Seattle first, and those areas and neighborhoods got this level of service. Unfortunately, as Peter said, I think we've learned each step along the way things we wouldn't do again. So when we came to planning light rail through Bellevue, where I'm from, we had that experience in front of us, that experience of what had happened, and we committed ourselves that we were not going to see that happen in our community. And so we worked very, very hard at making sure it was grade separated throughout virtually all of the East Link alignment. I do like to remind people that Bellevue is contributing approximately half the value of the tunnel the city is, which the Seattle wasn't doing at that time, although, the partnerships are growing. I mean, I think cities are starting to realize the value of putting money into these systems to make them work right. But I look even at my own city on the east side, and I see where is light rail serving and where is it not serving. It's serving downtown Bellevue, serving the most important, 9 square blocks, the most expensive 9 square blocks of real estate on the east side. It's not serving my part of town, which is where most the people live who can't afford to own and who are renting, communities of color. We have a very diverse and disadvantaged population in the Crossroads area of Bellevue. And those folks are not getting light rail, and they're not ever going to get light rail. In fact, I was really adamant when we started planning ST3. I want to see what it looks like to send light rail right up 148th Avenue Southeast, because I want to see what that looks like. Doesn't pencil. The densities are not there, so it didn't work. But to me, that's why it's really critically important that the whole system works seamlessly together, that the buses feed the light rail system so that everybody has access, including the folks who can't afford to live in downtown Bellevue. I think that's the imperative that I take away from this, is that we need to make sure this system is seamless, easy, affordable for everyone, regardless of where they live. Light rail can only go so many places, but it's the spine of our system, and we need to feed people into it. I could probably talk about this all day, but that's my thought for now.
Yeah. Well, I think race and social justice is a really important and critical part of building out good infrastructure. And I want to positively call out some programs that agencies are doing. The City of Seattle has worked for 15 years on a race and social justice initiative. King County has done a ton of work on that. And it is a starting place, and there is a lot of work that needs to be done institutionally to recognize some of the institutional unintended consequences of 100-year decisions that we're making, right? Like the original alignment took a long time, and I think took was made 15 years ago, and we're experiencing some of the impacts now and will forever. And I think moving forward in this new year and the new phase of building out Sound Transit, I think it's going to be critical, both at SDOT and at Metro and at Sound Transit, to continue to recognize and build really good internal programs on recognizing where this institutional racism does exist, and where the board can recognize that and have a public conversation about the 100-year decisions we're going to be making in the next 10 years.
So, speaking of Graham Street Station in Southeast Seattle, it obviously did not get built in ST1, and now we're looking at, and it's going to cost twice as much. 130th Street Station has also been deferred, and I'm wondering if that is a good decision in light of what we've learned about the fact that Graham Street Station did need to be built and it did cost a lot more. Wouldn't it be better to figure out a way to do 130th Street Station now rather than waiting and paying twice as much in however many years it takes to actually build it?
Yes.
Well, my board member's already spoken, so, but he's right. I mean, so there's a singular reason why we are challenged in shoehorning 130th Street into the construction schedule for Linwood Link. And it has everything to do with the dynamics that we spoke about at the very beginning of this session. We already have, because we are in the engineering stage, a letter-written commitment to Linwood Link project as it was submitted to the Department of Transportation for $1.174 billion. My singular fixation on this is to make sure that we do nothing to endanger that money. When you reconfigure a project and say, oh, thank you, after you've submitted all of the, and this is voluminous numbers of matrices and statistics and travel time forecasts and everything that qualify you for that money. When you sit and say, oh, well, now we'd like to add a station, it's going to actually change the alignment, or we're going to have to do some new environmental work, and it changes the cost-benefit analysis of the project, you're giving the Department of Transportation an opportunity to walk back that agreement and say, no, we'll continue to work with you. You just need to start over from the beginning. And trust me, when I was FTA administrator, I did this to other cities. So this is not a kind of theoretical, all right? If we can get FTA and DOT to agree that we can build 130th Street Station at the same time as we're building the rest of Linwood, I am for it, and we will work to make it happen. But we can't put $1.2 billion at risk for that important element. So I'm having conversations with the FTA about this, but tell me who the new political leadership is there and tell me where they're coming from and their responsiveness to it. And that will make a night and day decision at the time frame in which we can do 130th Street.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I think that one of the best ways for us to respond to that is to make sure that, in light of the previous question too, that we're building communities for people nearby the stations. I mean, I come to this job with a fundamental belief that it's crazy that we live in a world where parking for cars is cheap and housing for people is expensive. So we need to flip that equation on its head and make sure that we're fighting in communities where we're making these investments. And particularly, I'm proud of the fact that we're building frequent and reliable transit out to communities where people are being displaced to right now. The suburbanization of poverty that we're seeing in this region is happening all around the country. But we're one of the few metro regions that's actually responding to that suburbanization of poverty by building frequent and reliable transit to those suburbs. So I think in addition to the important conversation that we're having around zoning and density here in the city of Seattle, we need to make sure that we're organizing and having similar conversations around affordable housing, zoning and density in those other parts of the region too.
I think it's interesting. Keep your mic, because I have a follow-up for you. It is interesting, though, that all those regions that you talk about in the suburbs, it does seem that they are more welcoming to transit in a certain way, in that they're willing to upzone and they're being more willing to take density than Seattle. Seattle is really, in some ways, the biggest obstacle to density at light rail stations. And you can agree or disagree with that. That's my opinion, but I'm wondering if, you're chair of the land use committee, and when there's inevitable opposition to density around light rail stations in Seattle, as already has been, what are you going to do to make that happen in Seattle in particular?
So we're starting today with the conversation around zoning changes in the U District neighborhood and the Roosevelt neighborhood. Those two stations themselves have undergone one set of planning processes back before ST2 passed, and now we're updating those plans to allow for more density around those stations. In the University District, we're allowing in some places towers up to 300 feet. In the Roosevelt neighborhood, we're allowing for taller buildings, but we're also planning really extensively with Sound Transit on the Sound Transit site to provide more affordable housing at the station location. But Erica, you're absolutely right. This is a lot about political will. This is about making sure that council members that represent those districts where we're going to see light rail investments also are willing to stand up to single-family homeowners who are saying, don't turn my single-family home into a place where you could build a duplex or a triplex. I feel as the chair of the committee that it's my responsibility to make sure that we're a welcoming city for everybody, and it's really disturbing for me when I hear on my bus, as I did the other day, somebody talk about how glad they were to see neighborhood district councils stand up for single-family zoning, and then in the next breath disparage the president for wanting to build a wall between the U.S. and Mexico. I see those two things as actually linked. I see us as a city really needing to build more housing for more people because we're a city that's adding 40 people per day, but we're only building 12 housing units per day. And that's creating an economic circumstance where people at the middle income and the lower income are being forced out of the city. And that means we need political will for folks to step into that space and create change for more density around those stations. I firmly believe that. It may result in me only having this job for 4 years, Erica, but if that's the case, I feel like I'll have gone down on the right side of history.
Can I give Rob a bit of a break here on this, though? But there's a historical context to what's going on in Seattle around light rail stations versus what's going on in the suburbs around light rail stations that I think is important. They start from a different place. When you talk about, say, Eastlink has 4 or 5 stations in the city of Bellevue, and they stop in primarily nodes that are commercial nodes in places that are not built out as residential areas. And it travels through places that are less dense and less well established. I mean, Bellevue as a city is only about 60 years old. And a lot of what's there now wasn't there 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So they've got a sort of a more mature build out in Seattle. And that, I think, translates into more people to be concerned about changes in the area than you have in some of these other places. So I just want to give them a bit of a break, just a bit of a break. They've got a harder challenge in some ways around this issue. And the other thing I wanted just to give a little pitch for, at King County, I initiated and my colleagues supported last year some funding and a motion to direct the county to start working on a regional look at affordable housing. Because we talk about nodes around transit stations, hugely important to allow for housing to develop there and to make sure that some good percentage of it is affordable housing, not just high-end luxury condos around the stations. But, I mean, affordability and housing costs are primarily a regional problem. Seattle's big enough that it makes it look like a metro problem. But what happens when you can't afford to live in Seattle anymore, you might move to the east side, to where I live, East Bellevue. And then when you can't afford to live there anymore, you're going to move further out and further out and further out. And this is rent and not just drive till you qualify. The rental prices are driving people way far out, which increases the travel times for people, decreases their quality of life, decreases their health outcomes, and basically makes our traffic worse. So I'm going to be convening, along with my colleagues at King County, a group of people to talk about the regional aspect of that drive till you can afford to live and what we all can and should be doing to make sure that there's affordable housing and a range of housing options throughout the county and the region that people can afford to live closer to where they want to be. I think there's a regional aspect of that we haven't really worked on recently anyway. So that's going to come.
So I want to go to a related audience question, which is, when is affordable housing going to start going up on the surplus properties? And I'm also, one question that I had specific to Seattle is, Sound Transit has proposed building lots and lots of affordable housing on surplus properties left over from light rail construction. And in Seattle, the definition of affordable housing for Sound Transit might not pencil out. So it's, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but housing is more expensive in Seattle, and so it's going to be hard to build housing that's affordable on those surplus properties here. So when is it happening, and what about in Seattle?
Good question. Let me break it into two parts. When is it happening? I'm not sure I would have phrased it the way you did, that Sound Transit has offered to build lots and lots of affordable housing. What we have and what we're fully committed to implementing in the most forward-looking way we can is a requirement to make surplus property available first to affordable housing. And affordable housing actually is defined in the RCW as it relates to us as 80% of average median income. So that is, depending on, it might be, if you will.
And 80% of the housing, just as long as we're in the weeds, has to be affordable to those
well, and
people.
80% of the surplus property. It's like this 80-80-80 construct that I'm sure made sense at the time. And so, but it doesn't matter. I mean, we will be challenged to make it all work because it is a whole new line of business. We are hiring some new senior staff to oversee it. There's going to be a lot of community outreach in terms of putting it together. But in terms of when it's going to happen, I was actually just looking at the schedule. This is going to be something that I shouldn't get out ahead because we've not yet briefed either the two board members to my left or the other 16. But we have a schedule now, and there's actually going to be a lot of surplus properties offered up in 2017, in the 2017-2018 timeframe. And in fact, we will be using the experience of those offers as a learning experience to formulate the policy that the board committed itself to in the ST3 plan, which the board members will remember we committed to doing within 18 months. So, and so those will be, now how you raised somewhat, you said you don't want to get in the weeds because I think you know it's a weedy question. How do you get it to pencil out within the city of Seattle? It depends in part on the property itself and what its value is. It is hard. And this is one where we are still awaiting some clearer answers from the Federal Transit Administration as to what we will be allowed to do. And let me explain why. It is easier for projects that have no federal money. When you have projects that were touched with federal money, even $1 of it, you are required to get fair market value for the property. And the concept behind it is that the federal taxpayer gave you money to produce transit, and if you don't need the property that you used it, the taxpayer or the system should get its money back. Now, that is a very narrow view of what the purposes of these programs are, namely just to build the transportation facility. But it pencils out very differently if Sound Transit is required by making the property available for less than fair market value. We would have to pay the federal government back, and that has to go in the calculation of the cost. We are trying to work through with the FTA getting a little bit more leniency on this question. We are dealing with an agency that is right now run by a civil servant until there's political leadership there. These are, as you might imagine, somewhat politicized questions. We don't know what the answers are going to be, but it changes the math depending on what the answers are going to be. We have separately, I will tell you, have worked with Congressman Earl Blumenauer, who's kind of a leader in this area in Portland, because he and I were in a conversation about this, and I was explaining our TOD initiative, and he is actually working on legislation that would, if you will, broaden the mission of these dollars, not just on affordable housing and transit, but the idea of what can communities do with federal transportation dollars in improving the community writ large, rather than just building the transportation facility. Now, I think Earl's got a lot of great ideas. Earl is also going to be in the minority and is going to have a very tough sell with the Republican majority as well as with the Senate. But, at least we're in a dialogue of how these rules might be changed to make things somewhat more flexible.
This issue of the surplus property value and how that impacts the ability of any private developer to build affordable housing is something that we've anticipated because, it's been an issue that we've seen for a long time. And there's some tools One of my favorite that's been developed is called the Regional Equitable Development Initiative, the READY Fund anyway. And it's a revolving fund. It was created after a discussion at the Regional Council on this exact issue about the value of land is high where we're building. And as soon as we announce that we're building, it goes up even faster because light rail is coming. And so the purpose of this initiative was started with $5 million in seed money from the state, the county, local jurisdictions, including Seattle and the Coalition of East Side Cities, and now has grown because of private foundation adding to that government money. And what it can be done is it can be used specifically to purchase land near the stations so that it is affordable to develop on it. It helps with that affordability equation to make it possible to pencil. And then the idea is that the land then flips, and when it flips, the money gets paid back in, and we can continue doing one project after another. This is just getting off the ground. I mean, we're really, there's a lot going on in this area. It's very complicated, but you're talking about the cost side, I'm talking about the funding side. There's different ways to attack the problem.
Briefly, what I would say is that the City of Seattle is focused on affordable housing in 3 different mechanisms. Our housing levy, which voters adopted last August with nearly 75% yes approval, is traditionally focused on people leaving homelessness, so the 0 to 30%. We also have a developer incentive called our multifamily tax exemption credit, which allows developers to get access to financing and in exchange builds housing for 12 years for folks at 80% of very immediate income. Next Tuesday, my planning and zoning committee is scheduled to pass changes to the university district and its zoning to really focus at 60% of very immediate income. That's a missing element of our population. It's effectively families of 4 that make about $50,000 a year. So think about your teacher and barista couple or 2 people working at a nonprofit, for example, as qualifying for this kind of program. And so for us, those zoning changes that we're going to make as a city are focused on that 60% of very immediate income for a 75-year term. Every new development in the city is going to be required to pay into a fund to build affordable housing or build affordable housing on site. So this is a really wonderful opportunity for us to really address affordable housing in the city. And for Sound Transit, I see this as critical because there are really 6 areas of the city where Sound Transit still owns land, where we could be talking about partnership within each of those 3 areas, 30%, 60%, and 80%. We start in the Rainier Valley with some of the surplus properties we have, and Peter outlined some of that. We've got a big property at First Hill, which is zoned really tall, really hard to build 100% affordable housing in a really tall building, so we'll likely need to have some partnership with the private sector market rate development there. Capitol Hill has had a very intensive and long process that we have learned a lot from to build both joint development on market rate and affordable housing there. And then you move into the University District, where our primary ownership is actually with the University of Washington, which plans to build a commercial development there, which would again pay into an affordable housing fund for the University District. The Roosevelt neighborhood learned a lot from what happened on Capitol Hill and is actively working with Sound Transit right now on a set of requests for proposals so that we can open housing when the light rail station opens, as opposed to what we're doing on Capitol Hill, which is open that housing several years after the light rail opens. And then in the Northgate neighborhood, the city and the county have contributed $20 million towards affordable housing at the Northgate station. We're also looking at zoning changes in Northgate to allow for taller buildings, again, around the station. So it is a critical opportunity here for us to make sure that jurisdictionally we're working within several different layers of government to make sure that we're getting this right.
Yeah, I just want to quickly applaud and give Rob a chance to breathe. He made a very important point. The solution for some of these sites is mixed income housing. And the other thing that is the mix that could help do this is King County has a program, Seattle has a program, we have our program, and we have the property. And some of those things where the federal rules won't allow something to do, perhaps, frankly, resources from other agencies around a broader vision can make it all happen. So partnership is going to be really critical going forward.
And I should add, Peter, I think that the data,
One last thing.
The data really proves that mixed income is much better. When you're building in a whole neighborhood and there's one building that has all the poor people in it, that is not as good as building 10 different buildings that have poor people living in all of them. And so I think that's going to be really important for us to consider moving forward. The outcome for kids in particular, yeah.
Okay, we're running out of time, we're going to do these last, hopefully, couple of questions as a lightning round, by which I mean just whoever wants to answer, jump in and do so quickly. We got a question from the audience. How do we create a welcoming environment for refugees and people of limited English proficiency on our transit system? Quickly.
Because this is the lightning round, I'm going to say really quickly, one of them is to make sure that we are fulfilling our responsibility to make sure that we have signage and communication and information to them in their native language. And it's not just about having something buried in the website where if you look really hard, you can finally find the timetable in the Hmong language. It's about having real outreach with communities and ambassadors from those communities that will do part of it. Because we're in a lightning round, I feel compelled to mention one thing that is not on that topic. There's a lot of talk about now the post-ST3. Right. I'll be quick, but I'm going to be quick. There's a lot of talk about now we're in this post-ST3 environment, which is great, and the victory of ST3 was a great thing for the region. Don't lose sight of the fact that when MVET taxes go up next month, that there's going to be public blowback. That for many people in this room, we're very focused on getting that ballot measure passed. There's going to be some buyer's remorse from some people, I suspect, as the tax bill comes rolling in. And the biggest increase, on a percentage basis, will be the MVET increase that will come next month in the month of March. We are going to need to continually to make the case about what they're getting for those taxes. And I wouldn't want everyone to just sort of look like all about implementation and all about the future and not continue to defend the decision that the region made.
I'll go lightning quick. I think just to echo what Peter said, is including diverse communities, not asking us how we should be communicating with immigrants and refugees, but talking to them and making a space and meeting people where they're at to include them in that planning process. I think in the development of the Sound Transit package and some work that we did with these people up here, we heard a lot of good feedback in the development of the package, and I think that needs to continue and be very intentional about hearing from people to serve those people well.
Do you want to take a quick...
Choices is selling themselves short here. They did a tremendous amount of work. They partnered with Puget Sound Sage. They were down on the ground in south areas south of Seattle, working with students, communities of color, people who live in a trailer home, this is the wrong word, but mobile home park, and all kinds of, immigrants, people who don't speak English, and bringing them into our planning process in a way we hadn't had them in before, and I think we need to learn from that and continue that. But she needs to take some credit, so I just wanted to hand it over there.
Great. All right, we are out of time, so I'm very sorry to everybody who did not get their questions answered. Perhaps some of these folks can stick around. Not making any promises on their behalf. But thank you all so much for coming to this event this afternoon. Thank you to our panel, and have a great rest of your day.